You are attending the breakout session on grazing management strategies with the lovely Roxanne Morgan, who is with the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries, or QDAF as I like to call it. Now, whether you're new to grazing or whether you've been upgrading your skills for decades, the challenges you face now through climate, water management and even stock management require consistent skills updating and upgrading of information. Well, growing up on a cattle property near Middlemount, Roxanne Morgan's affinity with animals led to veterinary science, and her love of the land secured more than 20 years of grazing cattle on the central Queensland coast, so she's definitely amongst good company. Believing her love of cattle and steak, good eating steak, is all about balance, you'll find her presentation as the Beef Extension Officer with the Queensland Department of Agriculture and Fisheries highly informative. I'll leave the stage with her.
Thank you, Kim. That's a pretty tough act to follow. Hopefully we'll do it justice. So thank you for attending this morning. I was kind of hoping that we'd get everyone just to introduce themselves to who they're sitting next to, but there's a few people with some gaps between them and they probably know the people they're sitting with, so we might not worry about that one. Instead, I'll go on. I'd just like to get a feeling of who's in the room here today. So I'd just like, if you can put your hands up, if you currently manage under 50 hectares of land. Yep. Keep your hands up, please. 50 to 100 hectares. Keep your hands up. So the idea is I just want to get an idea of who's actually got some land, how much land they've got, and then the people whose hands aren't up will be the ones who are here for some other reason, and that's fine. So more than 100 hectares? Over 500 hectares? More than 1,000. And so we've got a pretty fair mix in the room. Next, you put your hands down now. How many people have been looking after land for less than 5 years? Yep. Less than 10 years? And what about forever? Righto, all good. So who here breeds cattle? And who trades? So who buys and sells? Yep, so we've got mostly breedings. Who's comfortable with their patch at the moment? Who's happy with how their patch is performing? Yep, excellent. And who's looking for improvement? Awesome. Yep, we can all find something to improve all the time. So that's great. Righto. So just briefly give you a little bit of background for myself. So we have 120 hectares just south of Mackay, of which 22 hectares is ex-cane ground and 14 hectares of that we use for Pangola hay. 17 hectares is unusable salt pan, which is what that picture shows, which leaves us about 80 hectares left for grazing. So our land types, if you look at the far picture there, the predominant green is coastal wetlands, so that's what the majority of our place is. The blue section is alluvial flats and plains, and part of that is what was cane ground. That's what's now under hay. And the lighter green area is these marine plains and tidal flats. So we're very coastal. These land type maps are available to everyone. You just, through the Long Paddock website. So I've just got down the bottom here, longpaddock.qld.gov.au. There's a multitude of reports that you can get there. just by knowing putting in your lots on plan, or even for a lot of cases, if you just put in your road address, it will come up and you'll be able to see from the map which are your titles that you can click on to access a multitude of reports. But one that's handy to look at is your land type report and how accurate it is to what you consider your property is on. So we tend to have predominantly sown pastures. So the tropical sown pastures, in particular Pangola, Tully humidicola, Rhodes grass and Mekong. We've also got some Jarrah grass, a bit of Soteria, and also some signal grass. So in terms of legumes, our predominant ones are Ceratro, Centro and Seca. We also have joint vetch, Buddha pea and Phasey bean. Desmanthus is something that we're keen to introduce as well. And like everybody else, we have undesirables in our system. Predominantly, that's Bloomsbury grasses. We do have some giant Parramatta and also a little bit of GRT. We have Devil's Fig and Urenaberg and Lantana. This is a photo of one of our hay paddocks. You can see Phasey bean. Also the vetches are in there. The other photo is predominantly humidicola. That photo also shows you what animals we have. So we generally run 23 breeders with 23 calves or 23 weaners, depending on what time of the year it is. We have 23 yearlings, about 14 two-year-olds and a bull. So we calve from late October to early December, and we wean in between May and June, which depends on how the season is running and what our cow body condition score is. We sell animals when they're ready or when seasonal conditions or market conditions indicate. So cows are pregnancy tested at weaning. If they're empty, they don't stay. Essentially, mature cows often have enough fat cover on them that by the time their milk's dried up, they've got a ticket to the meatworks. Obviously, some of the younger heifers might need a little bit of time to finish before they're ready to sell, but they don't get any second chances. We don't have enough land to carry passengers, is essentially the thing at our place. And we also have 10 horses, so they're our passengers. So I'm just going to talk a little bit today about grazing systems. So the main grazing systems are continuous, where livestock are left in one paddock for an extended period of time, often that being around 12 months or even longer. Rotational, which is recurring grazing with periods of rest in 3 or more paddocks, or technically it's moving through a series of paddocks, moving stock through a series of paddocks so that by the time the last one's grazed, the first one has been rested long enough to allow pasture regrowth. Tactical grazing is a more flexible method. So the idea of tactical grazing is to meet different animal and pasture objectives over a period of time. And that's what most of our grazing system is. And finally, there's cell grazing, is small paddocks, heavily stocked for short periods of time, followed by long spells. Now, regardless of the system, they all have benefits and they all also carry risks. But what's really important to know is to optimise your production, you really need to know what you have so that you can optimise your production while maintaining land condition and biodiversity. So grazing management strategies, the main aims should be to maintain your 3P plants, which are palatable, perennial and productive, in a condition that they can respond effectively to rainfall. We also aim to maintain animal production, so we at least want to be able to hold body condition on dry stock. And in our neck of the woods, if you're struggling to maintain body condition on dry animals, then, and you've got cows with calves in that system, then there's no way that you can maintain your system with that sustainably. The other thing that we aim to do is maintain or improve our land condition. So there are a lot of things to consider when it comes to grazing management strategies. So some of these we can have more influence over than others. Obviously the climate and the land type is not something that we have much control over. Our paddock size is important to consider, and that's something that we can manipulate. Really important one is the plant composition in our pastures. So does everybody know what palatable and unpalatable is? Does somebody want to offer up? Everyone's pretty quiet. Yep.
Well, palatable, what's edible?
Yep.
The livestock, unpalatable, what they don't eat.
Yep. Absolutely. And so the palatable plants are what drive production. The unpalatable ones are what limit production. We also talk about them in terms of increases or decreases. So in line with that, in a grazing system, chances are your more palatable plants are going to be your decreases, and your less palatable plants are going to be your increases. So that's a guide for you as to how sustainable your system's going. And you'll get fluctuations, that's to be expected, but something to be conscious of is what's increasing in your system and what's decreasing. Long-term carrying capacity, water distribution is another important consideration, and that's going to be more important obviously on your larger paddock areas. Long-term carrying capacity is the amount of animals that you can safely carry for over a planning horizon. So that's considered to be between 5 and 10 years. How many animals you can have on that piece of land, that paddock or that property, without impacting on land condition. Pasture yield is something like that's also very important. One thing in our neck of the woods, everybody has probably seen the photo of the 450 kilo steer that needs to eat 85 kilos of signal grass pasture to be able to maintain his body condition during the wet season up here. We can have our pastures in the peak of the wet season with as little as 17 to 20% dry matter. So that's something to be really conscious about, because an animal can't eat enough, can't physically consume enough of that pasture to maintain their body weight. So that's why we do see animals lose condition during our classic wet seasons. So maybe this year we haven't noticed a lot of that. We haven't had a really serious wet season, at least not at our place. So our animals have been performing really well the whole way through. The animal demand is something that we obviously have a huge influence over. We like to think of animal demand in terms of adult equivalents. So if you can convert all the different classes of animals you have, so your weaners, your breeders, your growing stock, into an adult equivalent, which is a 450 kilogram steer at maintenance weight, not gaining weight, then that allows you to compare between different classes so that you know what your demand is that you're actually expecting from that pasture. The amount of wastage is also something that we don't have a whole lot of influence over. We tend to consider that about a third of what's available is wasted by animals predominantly trampling it, defecating, urinating on it, also insect pressure, all that sort of stuff. Things like strip grazing can help to utilise and minimise that, but you're still looking, particularly in high production, high plant growth areas, at quite a lot of wastage. Young animals also tend to waste more than older animals. The other thing that we can influence is how much pasture we aim to have left at the end of the dry season. So I've got up there a rule of thumb of between 1,000 and 1,500 kilograms of dry matter. Now, with that figure, the really important thing to take into account is what the palatable species are, how much they make up of that 1,000 to 1,500 kilos. Because if you have a paddock that's 3,000 kilos dry matter of giant rat's tail grass, then your palatable species, they're going to be annihilated before you get anywhere near that 1,500 kilo residual pasture level. So that's an important thing to take into account as well. So we don't have a whole lot of time here today. So the focus that I've gone to is on the importance out of all of those things of land condition. So the land condition is the ability of land to respond to rain and produce useful forage. The drivers of land condition are the soils, the pasture, and the woodlands. So in our neck of the woods, the main contributor tends to be the pasture and the plants because we grow so much. Land condition is termed A, B, C and D, where A is good. They haven't gone to a exceptional at this stage. So we just have A is good, B is fair, C is poor, and D is degraded. So a couple of pictures here of some A land condition. You can see that there's good 3P species. There's a little bit of legume. It's probably not as much legume as there could be in that. And if we're talking about 4 different plant communities, then looking into that pasture, there probably is at least 3. And we have some tree cover. So similar with the other picture there, that's a Legumes paddock with some grass interspacing. B condition, we can see that there's some of our undesirable species coming into these 2 pictures, and particularly the Spirobolus species, and there's some lantana over in that far picture. C condition, we're getting more of our undesirable species. When I say undesirable, I guess thinking of the things that are really either toxic or declared pests. So I'm not talking so much about what we would normally term weeds, because as Christine was saying earlier on, they're serving a purpose in your pasture. So by undesirable, focusing more on the noxious plants. So that far one there, I guess one thing with C condition is knowing what's in between the undesirable species as well. So if down here there's some legume, if all through here is legume and pangola, then that's better than if what's down here is just couch grass. So then some D condition. A paddock, a GRT, while there's great ground cover in that, it's not going to be productive. It's not native. Trying to get these deconditioned lands back into A or B is going to involve a heck of a lot of time, money, effort, follow-up, and it may not be possible in some of those situations. So the reason why I focused on land condition is because everybody's probably seen the rolling ball philosophy before. I get some nods, yes, no? So essentially, if your land is in A condition, it's quite easy to have it slip a bit to B. Often some rest will bring that back to A. It doesn't take a whole lot to move land from A to B or B to A. When it comes to moving from B to C, you're starting to cause a significant decline in that land. So more weed species come up, a lot of regrowth of like tea tree suckers, a lot of lantana. They're the sorts of things you're looking at. You're probably going to need more than just resting to get that back to a B. When we come to D condition, whether we can improve it or not is even questionable. So there's a heck of a lot of effort required and time and money, and it just may not be viable. The real important thing is the effect that that has on the carrying capacity. So I should probably be able to take this off here. So you can see there that if you've got 100% carrying capacity when land's in A condition, that would be, if we said we could run 50 adult equivalents, then we can run 50 adult equivalents on that. If that land slips to B condition, we can carry about 75% of the animals that it could in A. So that would be about 37 adult equivalents. Once it slips to C, we're looking at 45% of its carrying capacity in A condition. So that's about 22 adult equivalents. And D condition, we've got a figure there of 20%, but obviously it depends on just how bad that D condition is. If it's a moonscape, you're not going to be carrying anything. At 20%, that's 10 animals. So to look at that in a different way, if we could carry our 50 animals for 12 months, alternatively, we might still want to keep our 50 animals, but we can only really carry them for 9 months if it's in B condition, or 5.5 months if it's in C condition, or 2 months if it's in D condition. So that's really important to take into consideration when you're thinking about what or how many animals you've got on your place, is to really think about what your land condition is and what it's capable of comfortably carrying. So I've just got a few pictures here. If we start at this first one, diverse pastures are the most challenging to maintain, but they're also the most productive. So that goes along with what Christine was talking about earlier today. From a DAF perspective, we tend to recommend to aim for grass legume mixes with a general guide of about 4 legume plants per square metre. So I appreciate that there's other plant communities that you want to have in there as well. That is the minimum. Like if you're looking at a monoculture of grass, then obviously your system's going to be even more teetering in terms of your soil health underneath there. Fencing is something that's has great opportunity, especially on small places, to better utilise your pastures and to give some areas, even within one paddock, extra rest, higher density grazing if you need to, any of those sorts of things. I'm a big fan of having an electric fence. So what's up the top there, you're looking at about $600 for, say, 20 tread-ins, 500 metres of electric fence tape and a solar energiser, and that allows you, with whatever paddocks you've got, to just manipulate the grazing so that you can reduce some of this unevenness. The picture over on the far top corner there, we've got this paddock of humidicola, which is 3/4 humidicola with a patch of pangola at one end. The cows go in, they eat the pangola, they come back to the gate and say, righto, shift us now. I've been able to run 300 metres of that electric fence and give them 1/4 of that paddock for a couple of days successively and keep them totally off that pangola so it gets more rest. There's really great opportunities with electric fences. When it comes to, obviously, your larger areas, then that's not going to work as well for you. But provided cattle are educated to electric fences, one wire can be awesome. I guess the other issue in our neck of the woods with permanent electric fencing is the amount of pasture, the amount of grass and everything that we grow that grows up through it. But it has amazing opportunities. I say, in that paddock there, if something was to get across it, it doesn't really matter that much. You definitely want to still have a permanent secure fence around your boundary, but with whatever your paddocks are that you've got, you can manipulate, and it doesn't really matter if animals go through it. I know a couple of properties around sort of in the Bowen-Collinsville area, they have a huge amount of just one wire electric fencing. Over time, they can then change where they have those fences. That's not something that you're going to do even every year, but if you find areas like that on that deconditioned slide where you're getting some erosion occurring from where a cattle pad's going, you have the opportunity to manipulate where your fence is to help reduce the the impact of that. I'm just having the throat cut thing too, so we'll move on.
No. I was 15.
Yep. Nearly done. Just to recap on those things, diverse pastures are the most challenging to maintain, but they're also the most productive. Aim for those grass legume mixes, if not more species diversity than that, but that's a minimum. Remove livestock from the start of the growing season until grasses have set seed. So that's wet season spelling. Whether we need to do that in our neck of the woods or not, all the time, I would say no. But what you really need to focus on is at least having rest in your pastures. And the more diverse the pastures, the more important rest becomes, because what you're doing is giving those ice cream plants that the cattle are going to all the time a chance to come back and compete with the less palatable species. So we talked about fencing. There's also the opportunities with virtual fencing. Last year we had the MacArthurs present here on their virtual fencing trial. I spoke to Ainsley a couple of weeks ago and she said it's definitely not at the commercial stage yet, but she's still keen to continue with their trials with that. There's been a few issues with the collars. So it's a work in progress, but it's an opportunity that would be great if we didn't have to actually physically fence areas to manipulate grazing. Manage for even grazing, weed control for production and for biodiversity, and maintain shelter. We all need some trees. So 5 to 20% is a pretty good compromise for the benefits that they add. And really important is to match your grazing pressure with your pasture production. So when are our pastures most productive? The production point is where your pasture growth has generated enough bulk and quality for grazing stock to sustain live weight gain without having to rely on last season's feed. That's normally considered to be 4 to 6 weeks after your break in season. Again, in our neck of the woods tends to be a bit earlier because we have such high rainfall. The green date is another term commonly used, which is the date by which you've received at least 50 millimetres of rain over a maximum of 3 consecutive days after the 1st of September in 7 out of 10 years. So with Bureau of Meteorology records, for our region, that's around Christmas time. So that's 7 out of 10 years. That still means in 3 years out of 10, it's after Christmas. So keep that in mind when you're aiming to match animal production with pasture production. So if I come back to what I said earlier, we have our cows calved from late October to early December so that their peak lactation coincides with our peak pasture production. And then once we come to sort of May, June and our pastures start to decline, weaners are all taken off, cows are all dry. Just in summary, have I got time, Kim? There's no silver bullets and one size doesn't fit all, I recognise that. Regardless of how you graze your paddocks, know what you have as a baseline and work to maintain or improve that. Diverse pastures are the most productive, especially if they contain legumes and everything else. Spelling gives your 3P plants their best opportunity to compete against less desirable or less palatable ones. And if your land is in C or D condition, it's unable to run half the number of animals that it could in A condition and maintain animal performance. So at the end of the day, it's about balance, and it's also about flexibility. So that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Roxanne. Does anyone have any questions? Yep.
Yeah, Roxanne, with... Is that on?
It should be. Can you put 3 on, please, Jack? Yep.
Yeah, Roxanne, with that, when you said about the steer being, what was it, 430 odd?
450 kilos.
450 kilos. He needs 85 kilos of grass to keep his weight. Is that what you said?
That's 85 kilos of wet weight grass. Yep.
It's quite interesting when you say that. If someone wants to challenge themselves, cut that grass to see the size of the area it takes you to cut that amount of grass to keep him going.
And how big that pile is. So we work on about 10 kilos of dry matter per day as what a 450 kilo steer needs to eat. So if it's 85% water, that's why you need 85 kilos to give him 10 kilos of dry matter. One thing that we use our hay for is in those really wet seasons where you might have 10 days of just constant rain and cloud, rolling a couple of round bales of dry hay out is just awesome for your cows. They just love it because being able to, they just can't get enough dry matter in the peak of the wet season. And that's a challenge for us here, which a lot of the rest of Australia doesn't have to worry too much about.
Anyone else have a question?
You said you're introducing Desmanthus on your property. How did you find it very challenging to get it established?
Yeah, we haven't introduced it yet. I want to. But because we've got mostly stoloniferous grasses, which are the creeping ones, yes, going to be a challenge. So that's a work in progress.
Just over here.
Yeah.
Bruce?
With that 80 kilos of grass, did they measure the whole? Because I know when cattle go into a paddock there, they'll only just take the tips off of all the stuff there. That's got to be higher in energy and sugars than if they ate the whole lot.
But if you think about pasture that's 85% water, those tips of leaves are going to be probably 90+% water because that's the soft
Yeah, but
area.
they'll be like double the sugar than the rest of it too, so, and the energy and the protein and everything else.
I guess the big thing with it though, Bruce, is you've got to feed those rumen microbes and there's not the dry matter to keep them going. So they're all, we term it arcing, when you get manure shooting out of cows. It goes through so fast it can't get digested quick enough because there's nothing to hold everything in the rumen for those rumen microbes to digest it. So there's a classic picture which I don't have it and I might have to try and get it so I can incorporate it into my presentations. But it was, so there's this 450 kilo steer and it was out Habana way and they were losing weight in the wet season. And then when they did the pasture analysis, that was what they found. Yeah. So while, as you say, they go and eat the tips and that might have higher energy, but the proof was in the pudding. The steers were losing weight. So that was what the basis of it was.
With that, Roxanne, a lot of people couldn't understand why you're feeding dry matter to cattle that are eating green feed, and it's exactly what you said.
Yeah.
It's to feed the bugs in their belly because it just passes through them that quick.
That's right.
And they go backwards quicker.
Yep. So in our neck of the woods, we have an issue of during the dry season, pastures are pretty ordinary after they've gone to seed, not much happens. Then you have a bit of rain, and if you're lucky to get your green date, you're breaking the season earlier than Christmas Eve, your cattle do really well, and then you come to January, February, March, and it doesn't stop raining. So we normally get about 1,000 mil of rain, about a metre in that time, and everything goes downhill again. And then once it dries out, sort of April, May, then it improves a little bit until you use all of that moisture that you had and your season declines again. So we sort of have two peaks in production, and that makes it more of a challenge to try and keep animals moving forward.
Yep, one more over here. Excuse me.
I just want to, not so much a question, but just to add to the discussion, something that really helped ourselves in our business, what we learnt through holistic management grazing training with Brian Welberg and Dick Richardson, is the term overgrazing. Wasn't even mentioned today, but is really poorly understood. Overgrazing has nothing to do with animal numbers. And you cannot, this is what we learnt and in our experience held true, and is a paddock cannot be overgrazed because animals graze selectively. They'll go in and they'll pick their favourite sweetest species. So overgrazing only ever happens to a specific one plant. And overgrazing's got nothing to do with numbers, it's about time. So it's about when a plant's been bitten down and then it's lost its, its root system sloughed off, and it's trying to recover, and animals come back and regraze it too soon. And just a basic rule of thumb that we learnt is about 3 days in good growth, when you've got the available moisture and sun, in about 3 days' time, that grazed plant can throw out enough of a leaf for the animals to physically re-bite it again. So, obviously we've all got time constraints and you can't do it perfectly every time, but as a basic rule of thumb that seems to have really helped our paddocks is trying to move animals at least every 4th day, because more than 3 days they can come back to their favourite little plant and overgraze it again. And with Australia's highly variable climate and our, long climate cycles of droughts and whatever, the long-term carrying capacity thing I don't really think is that relevant or that useful, because it's not about animal numbers, it's about managing your pasture and the time that animals are on the pasture and how much they utilise it. And our climate's that variable that I think we need to get away from worrying about animal numbers and focus on being flexible to the climate. Like, you have to be prepared to vary your animal numbers according to what your season has been. And just a little bit of a plug, KLR marketing. If you Google KLR marketing, it's Rod Knight, Graham Rees, and Jim Lindsay teach a marketing course that's all about how to buy and sell animals and stay profitable. And there's strategies there for breeders and steer traders or whatever as well, for both. And we've just found it really helpful, like as a tool to be able to, we've had a great season, we've got an abundance of grass, some of it's going moribund. How do we bring a heap in? The season's starting to fail, how do we get a heap out without going broke? So that was just two big things that helped us.
Yep. Always great to share knowledge. Will you take questions now?
No.
Anyone else? Yes? We've only got time for this question now because we need to get everyone back from the next room so we can get Simon Matson on stage. So we'll take this question and go from there.
Hi, we're a newbie to the industry. So the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries, is there anywhere specific on the website that we could access things about grazing, grass management, weeds control, that kind of thing? Because there's a lot of information out there and we're inundated, and then you kind of get everyone's input, which is wonderful, but not everyone's situation is the same or land is the same.
Yep, absolutely. So the Future Beef website is an excellent one with lots of tools and resources, and you are welcome to give Daff a call or come and see me, and I can give you my number after we're finished here now. And yeah, I can be a point of contact.
It's probably a good time to mention too, in the back of your booklet, there are 3 or 4 pages of resources that will actually connect you to further information, as well as guides, booklets, online research, imagery, practical tips and hints, YouTube videos. I think that Gilly's done a great job of putting together a heap of resources. There's like 4 pages in the back of the book for you to go and check out following this, and it all connects back to some of the topics we've seen discussed today and yesterday, and probably again tomorrow during the field trip at Serena if you're going. Well, if that's all the questions for Roxanne, yes? No.
Well, while Christine's getting the microphone, I'll just put my take on that. That Urina burr that we've got, I've noticed that in the last couple of weeks they're eating the leaves off that. It's going to be more roughage, probably not providing a whole lot of nutrition, but it's providing roughage and bulk. So yes, that helps. Also, to a point, your moribund grass from last year may contribute a bit, but usually because we have the heat and humidity, it all breaks down so quickly, and that's why we have the issues that we do. Browse would definitely help, but we don't have a lot of browse in our systems either. So I'll hand over to Christine and see if she's got anything more to say with that.
Thanks, Roxanne. I can really only refer to information that's coming out of the United States now with the grazing management, with the diverse polycultures, and just looking at rumen function. So we don't really have that many diverse polycultures that are being grazed in Australia. We don't, as far as I know, I haven't seen any research come out of that in Australia. We've certainly got landholder experience. But what the research is showing is that when you have... so grasses, for example, have very few secondary plant compounds in them, if any. I'm talking about your things like your carotenoids and those polyphenols and things that you're going to find in plants like chicory, plantain. They're really high in secondary plant compounds that totally alter rumen function. And your rumen function depends on microbial abundance and diversity. So as I said at the field day yesterday, 1 single drop of rumen fluid contains 10,000 times more microbes than there are humans on the planet. So if we've got 7 billion humans, we've got 70,000 billion, which is probably 7 trillion or something. It's a lot of microbes in the rumen, but it depends what kinds of microbes you've got in there and how many different kinds of microbes you've got in there. As we see with soil, it functions differently when you have different functional groups because microbes work in consortia. They always work in teams. And we have to have all those different kinds of microbes in there. So your feed conversion efficiency can double if you have sufficient diversity in the diet. So when we're talking about like 85 kilos of feed, you'd probably only need half of that if you could double feed conversion efficiency, but you also do have to have the fibre in there, and the things like plants like chicory, whatever, they'll eat the leaves, and then if they need more fibre, they'll eat the stem, because it has, which is something grasses, apart from grasses having a base, you know, the crown of the plant, don't really have that much, when they're green, I mean. So that in your forbs, there's a lot more variety of plant. There's plant leaves and plant stems, and then often there'll be flowers. If they go into a paddock that's got flowering forbs in it, the first thing they do, and graziers across Australia tell me this as well, they will walk across the whole paddock and eat all the flowers before they eat anything else. And the reason they're eating the flowers is they're so high in secondary plant compounds because that's what gives you the colour. all those different colours in flowers are trace elements and compounds that are not in grasses. So we really have to think it's a totally different ball game when we move away from managing grass to managing a diverse polyculture. And you definitely can get highly improved feed conversion efficiencies. And the other thing they've found from American research is that when cattle are grazing those pastures that have all those secondary plant compounds in them, they end up in the meat as well. So it's far healthier for people consuming that meat if the animals are grazing a diverse pasture. And by diverse, I mean with lots of different plant families, and especially we have to look at those secondary plant compounds. See how many of those compounds are in the plants, how many end up in the rumen, and how many now they're showing actually end up in the meat.
Well, that certainly opened up the dialogue, didn't it? Lunch is